Managing application configuration specific to the environment that it is running on is an important part of application development. In fact, one of the most common questions I get on this channel is related to how to manage configuration for a specific environment, how to update them, how to override them, etc. So in this video, let's dive into 5 different ways that we can manage application configuration like connection strings, secrets, URLs, etc. when building an ASP.NET Core application and hosting it in the Azure infrastructure. Hello everyone, welcome back to this YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name is Rahul and I make videos on .NET, Cloud and DevOps. Without much delay, let's head straight into my command line to create a brand new application where we will start learning how to manage configuration values. I will be pushing this solution up into Azure DevOps and then deploy it into the Azure infrastructure. All throughout, I will show you the different mechanisms of where and how you can store environment-specific configuration values. Based on your team and your application scenario, pick and choose one of the methods that works best for you. The one thing you should definitely stay away from is putting sensitive information inside your source code and pushing it up into your repository. With that in mind, let's head off to my command line and create a new application. I will use the .NET CLI and use the new command and specify Web API to create a new Web API application into the current folder. For a change, today I will use Visual Studio. So let's specify dev environment and specify the project name. In this case, this is going to be configuration source.cs project file. So let's open that in Visual Studio. The application is open. So here you can see this is the default ASP.NET Web API template. We have the program.cs, the startup.cs, and also a controller, which is the weather forecast controller. To understand more about configuration values, let's first head off into the app settings.json file and create some configuration values. For demo purposes, I have created a few upfront. Let me copy and paste that here. Here, we have a root demo value and then we have sub keys under that, which is key 1, key 2, key 3, key 4 and key 5. I will be updating these values based on the place that this is being set on. For example, in this case, let's specify app settings.json because this key is specified in app settings.json file. So let's specify app settings.json. I could go and paste this on all the other keys. So let's specify key 2, key 3, key 4 and key 5 all has the same value. Now, if we see this value in the final output, we know that this is coming from the app settings.json file. Similarly, if we expand the app settings.json, we have an app settings.development.json. We learned about the environments in ASP.NET Core in a previous video. If you're not sure about that, do check out how this particular JSON file works and in what conditions this file gets loaded. But let's for now go into the app settings.development.json, paste the same values. So let's specify the demo and in here, let's specify app settings development. Let's copy this and let's just paste it for 3 of them. These are the 3 keys that we wanted specific for the development environment, which needs to be overridden from the app settings.json. So if we come back to app settings.json, we can safely remove key 2 and key 4 because in this case, we don't want to override that. This is purely to show you how this is working. Now in your scenario, it might be a specific URL or a specific configuration key that you want to override for the development environment, in which case you would only put that key inside here. Now we need a way to surface out these configuration values. To do that, let's go into the controllers and create a new controller. So let's create a new class and call this myConfigController. If we navigate to the weather forecast controller, we can see this has 2 attributes, which is the API controller and the route attribute. I have talked about the route attributes in a separate video. You can check that out if you are interested to learn more. But for now, let's copy this and paste this on top of this class as well. Now this will give this a route name the same as the controller name. In this case, that's going to be myConfig. Let's also make sure to inherit this class from controller base because this is a controller class. So let's specify that. Let's specify an HTTP GET method. So let's say public let's return back a dictionary of string and string, which is going to be our configuration values, which can be represented as a key value pair. So let's specify that and just specify the get method. Now to get the configuration, let's inject in the I configuration in this scenario. So let's say I configuration. Normally, I would use the options pattern, which I have talked about in this channel before. But to make this simple and easy, let's simply assume that we have the configuration directly inside our controller class. So let's create and assign the property configuration, and let's start using this inside here. So here we can specify the configuration. So let's specify configuration. Let's get the section which is demo, because that is where we have all the values specified in. Let's then get all the children of this particular section and then convert this into a dictionary. So let's specify the first key value is going to be a.key, because all this children is going to give back a key value pair. And let's specify the value is going to be a.value. So let's return all of this, which means we will get a returned value. So in this case, what we are doing is we are getting the section demo. We are getting all the children of that and then converting it into a dictionary. Demo is this particular section that we have defined, and the children would be all these values. Now this is coming up as a key and a value pair, which is exactly what we are converting into a dictionary. Let's make sure to remove this extra components namespace so that this builds appropriately. Let's run this to make sure this is working as expected. The application is running. It by default launches the Swagger endpoint. So let's navigate to the myconfig controller into the get method and say try it out. Let's click execute, and this returns all the values as expected. So we have key 1 all the way to key 5 returned. Now you can see here for key 1, key 3 and key 5, for which we had environment specific values, which was for development, we get those values back. However, for key 2 and key 4, which was only defined in app settings.json, this values is not overridden. We learned how the environment specific values were overriding in the environments video. Let's now say we have a sensitive information to be saved. Let's call this as connection string. This could be a connection string to a database, to an Azure service bus, or any other sensitive information. Now let's say we need to have this value inside our code as well. Since this is a sensitive information, we shouldn't be putting these values in appsettings.json or appsettings.development.json. This, for local environment, should be stored as part of the secrets manager. Now I have a separate video which talks about the entire setup of secrets manager and how that works internally. You can check that out to understand more. But to show you quickly, all we have to do is right click on Visual Studio and specify manage user secrets. So here we have this option which you can select to create a secrets manager. So let's right click that again and select manage user secrets. This opens up a secrets.json file which is in a different location other than the current source folder. Here we can specify the demo section and then override the connection string. So let's specify just demo and specify again the connection string key. Now here we can say secrets manager because this is coming from the secrets manager. Let's save this and run this again. The application is running, so let's go into my config, try it out and execute. Here we can now see there is the connection string coming up and its value is getting overridden by the value from secrets manager. Now that we have seen the different ways to manage configuration on the local environment, let's move to how we can manage this inside the Azure infrastructure. I will first be pushing this application into the Azure DevOps repository and setting up a build deploy pipeline to build this and deploy to an environment in Azure. In this case, since this is a web app, I will be pushing this into an Azure web app. Let's first specify a build pipeline file inside this source configuration. So let's right click here and specify a new file. So let's search for text file. So here we can specify the file name as Azure pipelines.yml. Now if you're new to Azure DevOps and setting up build pipelines in Azure, I have a complete series on walking through this from the scratch. Now I highly recommend checking that out if you're not sure what exactly is happening here. But to summarize this, all I'm doing is specifying a file inside the source repository and pasting in some commands so that this application will get built and create a package that's ready for deployment. This package will later be deployed to different environments. So let's come back again and walk through this file that I'm going to create. So let's click Add and paste in some of the commands that I will be requiring. Now in this case, we are specifying the trigger to be main, which means any times a change is made to the main branch, it will be triggered. If you're using the master branch, you can also specify master. It specifies the build configuration to be released, specifies the image that this needs to be run on as an Ubuntu latest. Now since we are running .NET Core, this builds on both, so which is fine. We are explicitly specifying the .NET version. In this case, it's set to 5.x version. And then we use the .NET Core CLI task to build the application. Here we are using the publish command and publishing it into a specific folder. Later from this folder, I push this as a build artifact, which will make this available as a zip file for us to deploy. Let's see how this will work once we push this into the repository. So let's save this. To create a Git repository, let's navigate to the Git changes and click the Create Git repository. This prompts to save the configuration.sln file, so let's click Save and choose the file location. By default, when I use the CLI tool, it didn't create a solution file, but Visual Studio creates that automatically. Now, Visual Studio automatically staged all the changes, added a git ignore file and committed that. This is the default behavior, and I'm not sure why exactly it's like that. Now this here uses the master branch. We could either switch this into a main branch and then push it up, or simply come here and update this particular trigger to be master. So let's, in this case, specify master. If we come back to the git changes, we can see those files are changed. So let's simply amend the previous commit and commit all these changes. Let's navigate to my Azure DevOps, where the YouTube samples project. Here I have different repositories which are all used to demo the different videos inside this YouTube channel. So you can go through this, which is publicly available, if you want to check back on any of the source code that I have shown in this channel. I have already created a new repository, so let's select Configuration Store. Let's copy these commands to push an existing repository. Let's switch to command line and paste this in here and execute this. Now this is going to push all our changes into Azure DevOps. The changes have been successfully pushed, so let's come back and refresh this page. Now we have all the source code that we had inside our local in this remote repository. To start using this Azure pipelines.yml, let's head off into the pipelines section and go to pipelines. This is where you create a new build pipeline. So here I can specify a new build pipeline, specify Azure Repos Git because it is in the Azure DevOps repository, and let's choose Configuration Store. Now this automatically picks up the Azure pipelines.yml that I had added in my source. Otherwise, you can also write this configuration from the UI here, which I show in my other videos. Let's simply click Run, which is going to run this particular pipeline that we have created. This is triggered off a new job, which is exactly what is running inside the image that we had specified as Ubuntu latest. Now this is running on an hosted environment inside of Azure DevOps, which Microsoft is providing us. All I'm doing is just specify what kind of an image it has to run on. If you navigate into this job, you can see the different steps that's happening inside this pipeline. You can see the use.NET, build application, publish web artifact, etc., which is exactly the names that I had given inside my pipeline file. The build is complete and we have one artifact published. So if I click into that, you can see this is an artifact which is the web API. If you want, you can download this and see the contents of that as well. So let's click download artifact and simply open this file. Here we can see this has the configuration source.dll and the other related DLLs. We can also see it has the app settings.development and the app settings.json file. If any of this feels too fast for you, which obviously it is, I highly recommend checking out my independent videos where I show you how to set this up step by step. Let's navigate into releases, which is where we are going to create the new release for this application. So let's click New and specify new release pipeline. Since we will be deploying into an Azure App Service because this is a web app, let's click Apply on that template. Let's assume we have two environments. So let's say we are first setting up the development environment. So let's close that. Let's select an artifact for this. In this case, this is the zip file that we have just created. So let's specify the build as the source and select the configuration store as the build inside that pipeline. Let's click add. Inside the development, let's click the one job, and then this can be set up to deploy to the Azure web app of our choice. Now I have my subscription already tied up here, so let's choose Visual Studio Professional. This has a couple of web apps already created for this demo. If I navigate to my Azure portal, I can navigate to Resource Groups and select Resource Groups. Here I have the Configuration Store resource group, inside which I have created a lot of resources by default. Now in this particular case, what's interest for us is the two web apps, which is the test and also the dev. I know this by the icons here or also the name that is specified on the right side. Now the other resources I will come to as and when required. So let's navigate back. Since this is the development environment, let's select the configuration store -dev. Once that is set up, let's navigate back to the pipeline. Let's click the clone button, which will create a clone of exact the same step. Let's click this particular button, which is the pre-deployment conditions, and change that to manual, which means I can manually push to this particular environment. Let's select again and change this name to be test. You might ideally have one more environment, which will be production. Inside this particular task, let's navigate to the test and specify this to be test environment. Let's navigate back to pipeline again. Let's make sure we have a good name for this. So let's specify configuration source. Let's now start seeing the different ways of setting configuration values. Until now, all that you have seen is to see an end-to-end flow on how to set up this pipeline. The first option to specify configuration-specific values is to use the DevOps tool. Now you might be using a different tool, let's say GitHub Actions, or you might be using Bitbucket or any other tools of your choice. But most of these tools has a way to specify environment variables. Now in Azure DevOps, we can go to the variables section and start specifying variables for this particular application. So let's click add and specify a value here. Now let's say for the demo section and the first key, let's say key 1, we have to specify demo.key1. This is how the hierarchical values are specified inside Azure DevOps variable groups. Here, let's specify DevOps Variables. And we can also say this is specific to the dev environment. Now, how do I select this to be specific to dev environment? I can specify the scope and choose development in here. We can also add another key, let's say demo.key1, and specify DevOps Variables -test, which is going to be specific for test environment. And I can specify test. Now, if you want a value which is same for both these environments, so let's specify key 2. Let's simply specify DevOps Variables. And let's specify this is common. So let's keep that to release, which means anytime a release is made, this will get applied. So note, in this particular case, I have used dot as the separator because colon is not available as we use inside our .NET code. Once that is created, we need to go back to the pipeline and go into the development task. Inside here, under the Deploy Azure App Service, we can see a set of steps. This is basically looking at the zip folder that we have specified as the artifact and deploying that to the environment or the application that we have chosen. Now, if you look here, there is an option, File Transforms, to transform the file. So here, this will look at any file that you specify, find for a key that we have given in the variables, and then automatically replace that. In our case, we need to replace a JSON file, which is the appsettings.json. So let's specify appsettings.json. So this is going to use JSON variable substitution and override this particular file with all the keys that it finds inside the variables that we just added. You can see more information on this if you click this bubble dot here. Let's do exactly the same. So let's copy this, navigate back to the pipeline, go to the test environment, select the deploy app service, and expand this file transforms and paste this file in here as well. So this is going to look for this file inside this zip folder and replace all the values. Once all that is done, hopefully this works. So let's click save, which will create the new release. If you want, you can create a comment. So let's say new release created and click OK. So using the variables inside the Azure DevOps or in your DevOps pipeline is the first way to manage environment-specific configuration values. Now this has saved the pipeline, so let's click Create Release, which is going to create the new release. So let's click Create again, and we can see there is a new release created. If we click that, we can navigate to this particular release. If you want to come here otherwise, you can also go to Releases, go to Configuration Stores, which is the new release pipeline that we have created, and here you can see the new release again. So let's click this and go into Development, where you can see the progress of this particular job. So here you can see this is first initializing an agent, downloading the artifact that we have specified as the build source, and then deploying it to an Azure App Service. If I navigate back to Release 1, I can also go and click Deploy on the test environment. So let's click Deploy. This deployment is successful. So let's navigate to the Configuration Store resource group in Azure. Let's go to the Dev App Service and then navigate to this particular app. By default, this environment is set to production, so Swagger is not configured by the template. If you go into the source code and into the startup.cs class, so let's go to startup.cs, we can see that Swagger is enabled only when this is a development environment. To see the values, we can simply navigate to the /myconfig endpoint, which is our controller endpoint, and this will return all the values back. To see this as a JSON file, let's click F12 to open the network tab, and we can refresh this request again. So here we see the myconfig, and we can simply look at the preview tab. Here we see that the connection string value is still empty. The key 1 is specific to the dev environment, which is coming from the DevOps variables that we had set. Key 2 is again from the DevOps variables, but this is common for both dev and test because we had set this up at the release scope. All the other keys are still reading it from the app settings.json file. Note in this case, the application settings.development.json did not override this because this environment is currently production. This is because the ASP.NET Core _ environment is set to empty in this particular environment. This brings us to the second step of how we can override something inside the Azure infrastructure. So if we navigate back into the configuration store dev, which is the web app that we were just looking at, and if we navigate to the configuration section, here we have an application settings that we can override. So if you want to override any of the specific values here, let's assume we need to override the key 3 value. So let's come back to the configuration settings, add a new application setting and specify demo key 3. Since this is inside the Azure App Settings, let's specify the value as Azure Application Settings. Let's click OK, which is going to save that. Let's also make sure to click the Save button. Anytime you make a change to the application settings here, this is going to restart this web app. So keep that in mind if you are updating values directly inside the web app. Normally, if you want to do that, you would create a deployment slot and update it there and swap it over again. Now that this is getting updated, let's navigate back to the endpoint and click refresh. Let's navigate back to the endpoint, and here now you can see that the key 3 is now being set to Azure Application Settings. Now this is the second point where you can control environment-specific configuration values. If we copy the same URL and navigate to the test endpoint by simply changing this dev to test and navigate to that URL, we are now hitting the test environment that we had deployed. Since this deployment is also successful, we see the values as expected. Again, let's open the network tab and click refresh again. So going to my config, we can see this values. Key 1 is overridden by the test specific environment value. This we had set it inside the DevOps variables. The key 2 takes the common value and the other 3 still has the value from app settings. Since the Azure configuration setting was set only for the development environment, it does not reflect here. Until now, we have seen two ways. One is the DevOps variables and also the Azure application settings way. Now, let's go to the third way of setting the configuration value. Azure Key Vault is a popular service that is used to manage keys, secure information, and also certificates in the Azure infrastructure. Now, this is one place where you can again set up values. So if we go back to the Azure portal and go to the configuration store resource group, I have two key vaults created here. So here we have the configuration store dev and the configuration store test. Now you can see this from this icon or from the words in here. If we navigate into configuration store test, I have already created a secret inside this for demo purposes. So this is called demo -- key. Now inside of key vault, we cannot use dot or colon as a separator, because of which I have specified this as --. Now there are two ways you can use Azure Key Vault from an application. You can either directly use this from your code so that the application at runtime hits the key vault and gets the value, or you can use this from Azure DevOps. First, let's see how we can use this from Azure DevOps. So let's navigate to the configuration source. Let's go to the release pipeline and click the configuration source pipeline again. Let's edit this particular pipeline so we can start using values from Key Vault. Let's navigate to variables and to variable groups under this. Now earlier we had specified the pipeline variables which was directly belonging to this particular pipeline. But let's say if you have a set of configuration values that's applicable for different applications or different pipelines inside your projects, you can use variable groups. So let's navigate to variable groups and click Manage Variable Group. This allows us to create more variable groups inside our account. So let's click the plus variable group, which is going to create a new variable group. So let's specify configuration source -test, because we will be using this for the test environment. Here we have an option to link the secrets from an Azure Key Vault. So let's select that and then choose the subscription from which we want to select the Azure Key Vault. So let's specify professional, and this populates the key vaults that I have under this subscription. Since I had already created this, it shows up here. So in this particular case, let's select test. Now I have already authorized this pipeline to access this key vault, but in case you select one, let's say dev, for which I have not authorized, it will prompt you to authorize this particular connection. So this is basically giving the pipeline service connection access to the key vault and read values from that. So if you click authorize, it will prompt a dialog to enter the credentials and then add in everything automatically. For now, let's switch back to test where I have all of this set up. Now clicking add allows us to select the secrets from this key vault. Since I have only one, let's select demo -- key and click OK. Let's click save. So there is a new variable group configuration source -test created. So if we navigate back to our pipeline, we can now click the link variable group and link a variable group that we have created. In this particular case, let's select configuration source, and we can also set it to the specific scope that we want. Since we want this specific to the test environment, let's just select test environment in here. So you can choose release if you want to keep this common for both the releases, or development if you're having a configuration variable group for development environment. So let's select test and close this and say link. Now we have seen that this value demo --5 is in a different format. Now by default, there is nothing that converts this particular key into the demo : or demo dot format that Azure DevOps expects. So in this particular case, we need to go back to the pipeline variables and add a new key. So let's specify demo.key5, which is exactly the value that we are looking to replace. And we can again use the variable demo --key5 to replace the value from. So all I'm doing here is creating a key to map this particular value that comes from Key Vault into this format. You can also use other scripting mechanisms to do that, but this is just for demo purposes. Normally, I would use scripts to do this for all the keys rather than adding many such mapping keys. I hope this will get fixed inside the DevOps pipeline sometime soon. Now I can select the scope again, so let's keep this to test scope. Let's click save and click integrate to Key Vault as the comment. To get this to work, let's create a new release because we have made changes and click create again. This has created release 2 for the environment. Now since we changed this for test, let's deploy test as well. So let's click deploy on test. While we are waiting for this deployment, let's go into the Key Vault, and here we can see the value of this particular key. So if I click this particular version, I can see the value for the Key Vault version. So let's click show Key Vault, and it says this is from Azure Key Vault. You can add any number of keys inside the Key Vault by using the generate or import button. You can specify the name and the value for that particular secret. The test environment is deployed successfully, so let's navigate to the test environment and refresh this again. Let's click My Config, and here we can now see the key 5 is coming from Azure Key Vault. Key 3 and key 4 is still using App Settings, and key 1 is using DevOps specific to test scope, and the key 2 is from Common Scope. We can use Key Vault directly from code as well. I have shown this, how to set this up in a .NET Core ASP .NET application in another video. So I'll not show that again here. This brings us to the fourth mechanism of storing configuration values. In an earlier video, I walked through the Azure App Configuration in detail. You can check this, how this is entirely working and how you can set up and the different configuration values that you can use to control the behavior of app configuration. But for the sake of this video, let's see a quick demo. Let's navigate back to our source code and start using Azure App Configuration. To set this up, first let's add a NuGet package. So let's right click on the source and say manage NuGet package. Here, go to the browse tab and search for app configuration. So let's say Azure App Configuration. Let's select the Microsoft.azure.appconfiguration.asp.NET Core package and select install. This installs the required libraries to access the Azure App Configuration. Let's click accept, and this installs the package as expected. To start using this, let's navigate to program.cs and update this host builder to use the app configuration. I have the code already written. Let's copy and paste this, and I will walk you through this particular code. So here we have the default builder. Once the builder is set up, and I'm using the configure app configuration to override the application configuration. First we build based on all the configuration that we have, and then first we get the demo connection string. This has the connection string to connect to Azure App Configuration. Once that is done, we update the configure provider to use the Azure App Configuration as well. Now, if you're not entirely sure, I highly recommend out checking the video on Azure App Configuration to understand all of this better. But all we have to understand is this is now integrating with Azure App Configuration if we have the proper connection string in here. So let's navigate back to our Azure portal to get the connection string. So let's go to Configuration Store and go to the App Configuration. So let's click that, which is specific to the dev environment. Let's select access keys and select the primary connection string from here. So let's copy that, navigate back into our source and use this from our configuration file. Now, this being a sensitive information, we should not be putting this inside appsettings.json. So to update this inside the secrets.json, let's right click and select manage user secrets. This opens the secrets.json where we had specified the connection string secrets manager. So let's override this to have this connection string that we copied from the Azure portal. Now let's save this. Let's navigate to startup.cs. Make sure under services, we call services.add Azure App Configuration. Similarly, we also need on app method. So let's use app.use Azure App Configuration. This sets up the Azure configuration for this particular application. Let's run this application to see how this works now. So while this is running, let's navigate back to the Azure App Configuration for Dev. Let's go to Configuration Explorer, where I have already created a key. So in this case, I have specified demo key4 to have a value. As you can expect, the value in this particular case, let's navigate into this and click Edit is Azure App Configuration. Now our application is running, so let's go to My Config and select Try It Out and select Execute. Now in this particular case, you can see the key 4 is now set to Azure App Configuration. The connection string shows the sensitive information coming from Secrets Manager. Now this new endpoint that I have created is simply for demo purposes. In your real application, please don't create such an endpoint. Now once I push this to the DevOps pipeline, we can override the connection string as part of the variables or variable groups, or even specify this inside Key Vault. But I'll leave that to you. This brings us to the last and final way of managing configurations. Now, when we added the Azure App Configuration, we had to add an extra connection string. To me, the best way is to avoid these extra connection strings. You can do that by using a feature called Managed Identity if you're running in the Azure infrastructure. Managed Identity is supported by certain resources inside the Azure infrastructure. What Azure does is it manages the identity for talking with these resources. So we don't need to create explicit connection strings, but we can simply say this application can talk to this particular resource. Let's see how we can do that. So let's navigate back into our source code. Let's stop this. And instead of explicitly using this connection string inside the program.cs, let's use managed identity. So let's navigate to secrets.json. Let's remove this. So let's revert this back to Secrets Manager. Navigate back and use managed identity. So let's specify where token is equal to new default Azure credential. So this is part of the managed identity where this automatically selects a credential. Now this is missing a NuGet package. So let's click this and say install package Azure identity. Now I have a separate video walking through the entire of default Azure credential and how this works. I have also shown in how to work this locally. You can find the links to all these videos in the description below this video. Now that we have the NuGet package selected, we can specify this to the Azure configuration. So instead of specifying the connection string, we can specify a configuration and use this to set up using the default Azure credential. So let's simply specify config.connect and then specify this particular token. This also takes in a URI because it needs to know which Azure app configuration to connect to. So let's specify a new URI and specify a URL property. So in this case, let's simply give a URL which we will define shortly. And let's also pass in the token that is used to connect. Let's make sure this has the appropriate brackets and define the URL property. So instead of connection, let's override that with URL and specify a demo :URL. So let's navigate to appsettings.json and add a new property. In this case, this is going to be URL. To get the value for URL, let's navigate to the Azure portal. Let's go to Overview for the configuration store dev app configuration that I've created. Copy this URL and paste this inside our configuration value. Now, if this is specific for the development environment, I can also put this inside this development.json. Note in this case, this development is simply the local environment, whereas the development that we created inside our Azure DevOps is also set to production because the environment variable is not set. Since we use the same name for both the environment, it could become slightly confusing. So depending on your team, you can choose the names for these environments as it matches for you. Now let's leave this URL inside app settings so this gets applied even when we push this up. But you know how to override this inside the DevOps variables or inside Key Vault again. Now if we navigate back into Azure, if we go into the IAM control, we can see here under the role assignments that I have already given access to the account that the Visual Studio is running under. So here I have my email account and I have given this an app configuration data reader. So whenever the default Azure credential is working on the local environment, it uses my Visual Studio login, which is up over here, and uses that login to connect to Azure App Configuration. Now again, if this is confusing for you, I highly recommend checking out the other video. With all this set up, let's try running this again. The application is running successfully. So if we navigate back to the source code, here under the program.cs, We are no longer using any sensitive information or connection string to connect to Azure App Configuration. All it uses is simply the URL and then specifies the token using the default Azure credential. So if we navigate back, let's go to My Config, select Try It Out and execute. This again brings back the value from Azure App Configuration. You can see we have the URL as the Azure App Configuration URL and the connection string is back to Secrets Manager. So by using Managed Identity, we have removed the need of a connection string, which is an extra sensitive information. Let's push this code into the repository. So let's go to Team Explorer, go to Changes and stage all these changes. So let's say add Azure App Configuration and select Commit All. We can navigate back and push this changes using the sync button. So let's specify push. It pushes all the code into the remote repository. So let's navigate into our DevOps. So let's go to Configuration Source. Under Pipelines, let's go to the configuration source pipeline that we had created. Since we had set up the trigger to be master, any push on that has automatically triggered this particular build pipeline. Now this is going through the exact same build steps with the new code. And this is already completed. And we have the new artifact published here. So if we navigate to releases, we can click the new release to create a new release. Now if you want an automatic release to happen into the development environment, you can also click edit this pipeline and turn on automatic deployment. To do that, all you need to do is select this icon over here and say enable this. Again, you can specify branch filters in this release as well. But let's click save for now. This will only work from the next push onwards. So let's click create release for now and select create again. Now this has created release 3 for us, which is going to push all the code that has the Azure App Configuration into development. Now while that's happening, let's go and set up the development environment to have access to the Azure App Configuration. To do that, all we need to do is go to the Configuration Store Resource Group, navigate to the development application, so that is the web app that we created for Configuration Store Dev. Under this, on the left side, you can go to Identity and turn on Managed Identity. So let's click on and click Save. Now this is automatically going to create a service principal, or if you may think of it as a user ID, that you can assign to Azure App Configuration. Now you can copy this ID to find this exact same app. Let's navigate back to Configuration Store, go to the Azure App Configuration. So let's click the Configuration Store Dev, navigate to IAM, the access control, and click Role Assignments. Let's click Add and click Add Role Assignment. Let's specify a data reader role and search for our application. So let's say configuration-store-dev. This is our web app for which we turned on Managed Identity just now. Let's click Save, and this adds the role assignment so that this application that we've created can talk to the Azure App Configuration. You can see the type here is App Service or Function App. Let's navigate back to the DevOps. The deployment is successful. So let's go to the Dev application and refresh this. Let's go to My Config. And here you can see that the connection string is still empty. The URL has a value from App Settings, and it has also successfully connected to Azure App Configuration. We didn't have to specify any connection string to connect to this. Now, typically, if you're using Azure App Configuration, the only value that you will need is this URL and have all the other configs inside Azure App Configuration. This separates out the entire configuration from Azure DevOps or Key Vault or variable groups or any other source, which means you can manage all your configurations in one place, which is Azure App Configuration. Based on your environment, you can simply switch this URL inside the Azure DevOps pipeline. So all you have to do is come back to your DevOps under your variables section. So let's go back to the release pipeline, select edit, and under variables, you can specify demo:URL. So here you can have one URL for your test environment and one for your production environment. So this removes all the other configuration values and keeps it clean and centralized as well. But this works only if you can choose Azure App Configuration as your central configuration inside your team. However, if that doesn't work, you now know different ways to manage this in different places. I hope this helps you to understand more about configuration and how to manage this for an ASP.NET Core application running in the Azure infrastructure. We saw 5 different ways. 1. The Azure DevOps Variables. 2. We used the Azure App Settings. 3. We used Key Vault from within the DevOps. You can also use Key Vault directly from the application, similar to Azure App Configuration, which was our 4th one. And finally, we used Managed Identity to remove the need for any specific connection string as well. I hope this gives you enough information to choose the appropriate way to manage your configuration and also to keep connection strings secure. Make sure not to check in connection strings inside your source code. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. If you have any questions or feedback, make sure to leave a comment below. I will leave all the links to the relevant videos in the description. If you want to be notified of future such videos, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. This also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you and see you soon.